all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, doing our bit to help preserve the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths cross his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So today I'm going to read to you from Betty Warren's section on Cuke.com. There's a lot on her. I'll read the interview with her and a little bit more. There's too much to read. There's a whole biography of her on it. And, all you have to do is go to Cuke.com and write Betty Warren in the site search box, or go to interviews and get her, or go to people, names, Betty Warren. There's many ways to get there. And she's quite an interesting person. So here I'm going to start reading from it. More than interesting, she's an inspirational person. Betty Warren was, as you will see, one of Suzuki Roshi's first students. She now is, when did I date that? I think that's around 2006. Along with Della Gertz, an active member of the Disciples group. We had a group of people who were either ordained as priests by Shunryu Suzuki or who were very old students of his. She's in her 80s, continues to sit, and for some years has helped to lead vision quests in the Death Valley area. I interviewed Betty back in 63 or 64. Oh, 63. I mean 93. Oh, God. Oh, all right. I got to go back and fix that. Yep, got to fix that. All right. I made a note. I hope to get to it soon. I haven't been getting to the things I make notes of. I've just been trying to get the projects done I'm working on, but I'll have to get back to them. So anyway, here we go. So I asked, DC, I'm interested in knowing anything you have to say about Suzuki Roshi, what it was like back then, what you learned from him, what you've learned since then, what you think the good points were, what was established there, whatever. Betty, sort of a big order. I could begin with our first meeting. I had been listening to Alan Watts on the radio and became interested in Zen, so I enrolled in a class on Zen Buddhism by a Dr. Kato. One evening, and she did this at the American Academy of Asian Studies, where Alan Watts was the director of it for a while. In San Francisco. One evening, Dr. Kato had invited Suzuki Roshi to come to the class. Now, who she calls Dr. Kato was a Soto Zen priest, Kazumitsu Kato, who had been taking care of the Japanese-American temple, Sokoji. Since there hadn't been a priest assigned to it for a year and a half, Kato was young. He'd been in America since mid-50s, and I think he was getting a graduate degree in Berkeley and just taking care of Sokoji. Was the only Soto Zen priest in the area. Anyway, she goes on. There are special friends in the class, Della and Jean. Oh, she had some special friends in the class, Della and Jean. We were very much impressed by his charm and the twinkle in his eye, his friendliness. She's talking about Suzuki, of course. His English was not very comprehensible at that point. But I figured that might even have been the first week he was in America, in 1959. but we were charmed by him. He said at one point, "I sit every morning at 6 o'clock. Please join me." Della, Jean, and I did join him in sitting at 6 in the morning. We had every fifth day off. 5 and 9 days we had off. Also, we came every Sunday for a lecture. The group was very small to begin with. Ananda was there, Claude Dallenberg. Bob Hintz, soon Graham Petchy, and Richard Baker. Well, that was 2 years later. A little hard to remember. It was about a year before Bill Kwong came. Yeah, she came in 59. Bill Kwong came in 60. Graham Petchy and Richard Baker came in 61. Ananda had been there beforehand. He might have been in Japan at that point. But anyway, he wasn't called Ananda until the 70s. He was Claude Dallenberg then. And I say that 3 of you met Suzuki Roshi at the Academy in 59. And about a year later, Bill Kwong came in. She says, Bill Kwong came in a little later, I think. Do you remember Paul, the guy who was rebuilding the organ at Sokoji? Yeah, Paul Alexander. Sometimes there would be just a few of us, and sometimes maybe 10 or so. We would knock on the door. This was the little Japanese church, Sokoji. We would stand at the door, and Suzuki would come down and let us in. There was one morning when we stood outside, he put his head out of the second-story window and called down and said, "Go away, go away." We went away, but we came back the next day, and everything was fine. Never an explanation, never an excuse. That's because it was 4 or 9 day. He had this wonderful way of teaching, which was to pull the rug out from under his students' feet whenever he thought they needed it. At first, we had very simple accommodations. The church was not, it wasn't a church, Betty, it was a temple, was not set up for meditation. We positioned pews with the fronts together. We would climb up into this, and then with some pillows we would sit. It was quite a little while before we actually, and all the pews went downstairs. Before we actually, she's going to say, got to Tommy, or possibly they started with Goza mats. There were pews in the middle of the room for sitting for lecture. Around the edges, we got tatami mats and zafus and zabatans. We thought they were sort of hard, but we went along with it. He had a wonderful way of impressing people with how to get along, how to behave. You knew that you had to sit without moving. You knew that you had to be quiet. You just knew all these things from his manner. You mean he wouldn't specify? He wouldn't say anything. You don't move. He just said to sit there this way, so we sat. You didn't move until the bell sounded. How long did you sit? We began with 45 minutes. And I say, I remember he used to say he wanted to sit for 50 minutes. Betty says, there was one time during sesshin, he went out of the room during the sitting, and maybe it was 45 minutes later he stuck his head in the door and closed it again and went away. We were sitting there alone for it must have been an hour and a half before he came back. We were all about ready to collapse. He would do things like this to make it so we wouldn't expect things to be always the way they were. So I asked when she met him, she says May of 59. No, he arrived in May. Anyway, that's what I think now. So same month he first arrived. Well, I was so worried that I was wrong that I checked on it. And, he arrived like on the 21st or something of May. So she did. Maybe I'm right. She saw him the first week, but within a couple of weeks. And I say, you started sitting almost immediately with him. Did all 3 of you continue steadily? How long before you had your first sesshin? She says, well, I'm very poor at dates. Maybe it was a year. We had a little ceremony when we got our raksus. I think that was in 62. They were from Japan. strips that he sent for. Yeah, not like rock suits that we have. They were more like wearing ribbons around you. They were just strips. That ordination was at the end of the first session, something like 1960. Oh, well, the first session was in 1960. Oh, maybe there was. Oh, very interesting. Pardon me. Do you remember Mike Dixon back then? Oh, Mike and Trudy. They must have come like 62 or 63. I said, yeah, the group grew, and we had to keep finding more room. In Sesshin, we would have like 40 people or something. We had to eventually clean out the balcony and put mats around the balcony. And I asked, were you sitting in the upstairs room right from the first? Yes, they were. And she says, there were pews in the upstairs room. The Zendo was there. There were pews in the center of the room, facing the front of the room, where people would sit for Sunday lectures. Then all around the room were tatami mats. And she says, we moved the pews around every once in a while. I think he did it to give some of the fellows exercise. One time, he asked us to move all those pews from the upstairs to the downstairs and move all the downstairs pews to the upstairs. I don't know just exactly what it was, but the fellows were pretty busy. Well, they couldn't have moved all the downstairs pews to the upstairs, much bigger room. Oh, I bet it was that there was some wear and tear on the pews upstairs, so he wanted to rotate them with the same number of pews from downstairs. I bet that was it. Having pews in the Zendo upstairs did not last very long. I bet it didn't last over a year. How early on did he start giving lectures? He started giving lectures right away, even though his English was not up to it, but he studied very hard. Did he study with teachers' schools? She says, I don't know. He did go to some English class for a while then. She said, I think maybe he went to a class, but I'm not sure exactly how he did learn. He learned very quickly. At first, some of his English was a little hard to understand, but he soon was able to give very profound lectures. We had Saturday breakfast. We would sit and then have breakfast. Then we would work cleaning up the place, and then we would have another sitting. On Sunday, he would give a lecture. He was very strict with us, and yet he was very warm and friendly at the same time. You would never quite know if he was going to be aloof and stern or if he was going to be warm and friendly. He taught in a unique way. He would just sort of roll your problem back to you. For instance, he told us to follow our breath, count our breath. That would bother me. So I said to him once, the more I try to control my breath, the worse it gets. It gets too fast, too slow. I become preoccupied with trying to make it right. He just looked at me and said, oh, just sit. That was his answer. There was no answer to my question. And I say, do you think that's just his style, or do you think it's pretty much true that we just have to figure things out for ourselves? She says, I think it's very true. A lot of teaching just gives answers which might have an application to your use, or they might not be right or anything. Find the answer that is right for you. You have to somehow formulate it yourself. There's a story that Dick Baker told on himself. Dick was a very long and lanky person, and he had a great deal of difficulty in learning to sit. His knees just didn't bend. He sat up on two zafus with his knees in front of him, and very gradually and painfully he learned to sit cross-legged, and then finally lotus. Once, after about 5 years, Dick asked Suzuki, you know, I've been sitting for 5 years and my legs are still very painful. Suzuki just said, oh, and lifted his eyebrows as if he'd never heard of such a thing. She says, this is the way he tossed the problem back at you. And I say a lot of what he did was to put it on the moment and the person, give an opposite answer to somebody else, where they would be. And she said in a lecture, for instance, one week he might say you have to put your entire effort into it, and the next week he might say, no use trying, give up and all, and it will come. I'm not much on the technical philosophy, but there's something about Ji-Riki and Ta-Riki. Ji-Riki is self-power, and Ta-Riki is other power. No use trying, you've got to do your damnedest. And I'd say he talked sometimes about the double-edged sword. Sometimes double-edged sword is wisdom and compassion, but a lot of times I think he just used it to mean there's two sides. If you're on one side, he might just hop over to the other. And she says, one Saturday morning when we were sitting here, everything was quiet, and all of a sudden he just got up with various snorts, growled and barked at us and said something like, oh, so you think you're sitting? Well, you're not. And he got up and picked up the stick, and he went around and he gave every single person 2 real resounding whacks. And she says, that was pretty early on. And I'd say, have you heard of that? Of the tradition of the teacher going around and hitting each student? She said, no. We were accustomed to the stick during zazen if we asked or if we were restless. Well, or if you're asleep. And I said, well, it's called rinsaku when the teacher goes around and does that. She said, oh, we hadn't heard of that in particular. And I said, what were people's reaction to that? She said, there was not a sound. He made the rounds and everyone was whacked and no one said a word afterwards. And I say, how often did he do things like that? And she says, that's the only time he did it when I was there. And I say, I saw him do things like that. I guess when there were more people, he might have been drawn to that expression more. Not often, but maybe once every 6 months it was him like, you're all spineless. You're not interested in Buddhism. If I told you what Buddhism was, I'd just be sitting around myself listening to the sounds of your cars going up the road. You have no spine. You're spineless. Then the next day he'd apologize. Oh, I'm sorry. And she says he didn't apologize. We just took it. Like the time he told us to go away. I think probably with a smaller number of people, it was more intimate and easier for him to say less. She said he just bawled us out, then sat down and said nothing. And I said, we've talked about his having this pull out the rug teaching that you mentioned. Can you give any other examples of that? She says, I don't remember a lot of different examples. One week lecturing on one thing, next week lecturing the opposite. He had a way when he was lecturing, he would look right at you. He would make you feel that those words were directed especially toward you. He was looking right through your eyes to your brain. But I'm not sure that everyone else thought the same thing. And I said, well, what do you think was really happening? She said, he just managed to speak to everyone. And do you think he really was speaking to everyone, or was that just an impression people got? I think it was an impression. He really was speaking to me when I thought about that, but he was speaking to others also. And I say I heard that feeling. Sometimes it would be remarkable. There would be some very specific thing. I felt there had to be a certain amount of intuitive, maybe he wasn't aware of. And I think we all do that to some extent. But I think he really used his intuitively picking up on some focal point for a person and mentioning it. It's hard to get to the bottom of. Did you notice any change in him from the time he arrived? And she says he became more aware of our customs. One of the things he did at first, he had a staff, and he'd walk around the neighborhood with his begging bowl, and we told him that wasn't done here. and I said, would he put on a traditional Japanese begging outfit? They wear like a white sheet on the arms and on the legs, and there's like different gear, a conical hat, straw hat. Did he wear that? And she said he may have worn the hat. And I said there's a particular type of bib worn over the rock suit. It's the only time something's worn over the rock suit, sort of like a bag that you put the money in. There's a begging bowl, there's a bell. And she says the staff had a bell. When he hit it, he didn't do that very long. And I say that's what happened when Buddhism came from India to China. India totally accepts begging, totally respects it. In China, people thought they were a bunch of bums. The monks got more into farming and supporting themselves and being supported in different ways. That Chinese teacher, Dao Lun, he used to go and beg down Market Street. You know him, Gold Mountain Monastery, Chinese Zen master. He had a Taoist Buddhist group in downtown San Francisco and has a big monastery up north. He had a few people. That's the city of 10,000 Buddhas. He had a few people sitting with him in an apartment not far from Zen Center, maybe from 64 around there. Then he got more formal place around 67. And then in the 70s, they got one of the state mental hospitals in Mendocino and changed it to a big monastery. He used to do some begging. I guess there was begging in China. Maybe it was what you'd call ceremonial begging, not real. Yeah, that's like in Japan. Although they can get pretty good money sometimes in Japan going out and doing takuhatsu. And she says, yeah, he was trying to be noticed, have the community take notice of him or something. And I say, think so? That's interesting, sort of finding an appropriate way to announce his presence and the presence of his practice group. Takuhatsu is like a cultural thing. That was really early on, maybe once a month. She says, I don't know. I think he just did it a little bit. And people told him it was illegal. And I asked, what was his teaching? And she said, just his presence. Somehow he conveyed the idea that if he gives something, it was right. If he said sit, I would sit. From the beginning, if he said to sit there, was something to it that I might not understand for years, but I felt that he knew what was right for me. And I said, can you describe that? What is it when you meet a person and they say something and you want to do it? What is this? She said, all I can say is presence, just something about his bearing, look in his eyes, that you know it's the right thing. It's rare that you meet someone like that. And I said, have you ever met anyone else like this? She said, not before Suzuki Roshi, but I would say that Bill Kwong has this quality. I would try to listen to his lectures too, but it was more who he was rather than what he said that was so important. And I said, that's a toughie. One thing I want to do is look at the various things that people say about Suzuki, like presence. It's very hard to write anything. What's the difference between what he had and what some charismatic person has, say like Jim Jones, who had a very large following and helped many, many people. He was one of the few rays of hope for a lot of people. I think there was a time when there probably was something good about him, but people would meet Jim Jones and go, wow, this guy cares about me. I don't know if they thought I want to be like him. Maybe they thought he cares about me, a refuge, like poor people and minorities. Anyway, there are other people who people meet and will follow. It's not always as noble an experience for them. She says, I don't know if Suzuki had the charisma that some of those other people had that would attract a lot of followers. It was much more subtle than that. I just knew that if I followed him, I would eventually find a peace or happiness or way of life that was suited to me. I couldn't follow his way of life, but he had something to tell me about how I could carry out my life. And I'd say that's a good thing to say. You felt confidence when you met him that if you followed him and continued with him, that you would find a way for yourself. Not that you would find his way, but you would find your way. I meet a lot of people trying to find his way. That's maybe a trap. She said, I don't follow his way. I've lived at Zen Center, taken my life into the community as much as anybody has. But ever since I met him, I've been sitting practically every morning, even if I don't go to some place like Green Gulch to sit with others. I sit here on a well-worn sofa. I do meditation every morning and greet him every morning. And she goes to the picture. And I say, I know who that guy is. Here Betty says, I'm so ashamed I don't go very much to Page Street or Green Gulch. And I say, I think it's admirable you don't. I think the example of someone who can practice without the institution is a good example. And she says, I don't go for institutional things. I find that this vision quest work is a way of teaching without teaching. We get 5 or 10 people who go on a trip, and during that time, the trip is a week long. They're out solo for 4 days and nights. You find a spot a mile or so away from base camp and make their little camp, and you fast during this time, and a lot of them really find some pretty deep places. I don't give much in the way of lectures. I give them a guided meditation sometimes. My partner talks and talks. I scrub the lunch pots. It's very primitive camping. No picnic tables, no johns, no nothing. Sleeping bag on a little mat on the ground. And I say, you go to the southern Grand Canyon, the only place in this hemisphere that has deadly, poisonous, stinging scorpions. They're little yellow stinging scorpions. Oh, you go to Death Valley. And she says, as far as I know, there are no poisonous scorpions, just rattlesnakes. Anyway, I try more indirect ways to help them. If they ask me something, I try to answer, but I don't give lectures. I somehow feel that this is work. Sometimes people say, oh, you're such an inspiration for someone. I'm 78 years old and I'm sleeping on the ground. I love it. And I'd say to her that one time Suzuki said, the reason we practice is so that we can enjoy our old age. And she said, it certainly helped me. I consider myself a student all the time. I want to tell you one little thing about Bill Kwong. This was in the early times at Bush Street. Bill was in there several years. He was chief cook. I was the cook helper one breakfast time. We often had mush for breakfast with milk. This time we had rice crusts. We'd save up the dinner crust and toasted them. Very simple fare. I was sitting at the table and I said, should I put on the milk? No milk, hot water. I put pots of hot water on the table. When I sat down to pour hot water on my rice crusts, I started weeping for gratitude that I had hot water to put on my rice crusts. It was one of the most powerful experiences I've had. That was something to sustain me, and how wonderful that I had hot water and rice crusts. This was better than blueberry waffles with whipped cream, that I was alive, that I had this to sustain me. All through breakfast, tears rolled out of my eyes. I was so grateful. That's the type of teaching Bill Kwong does. Even at that early time, before he had gone to Japan, he studied at Rinsuin. He was teaching people. Well, Bill Kwong went to Japan, not for a long time, just to get transmission from Hoitsu, but, it might have taken a month or something. And I say, yeah, that sort of thing's hard to communicate, and I appreciate it. Betty says, for one thing, he was nobody special. He was profound, and yet he was humble. He loved little children. He would spend time playing with little children. Sometimes there was big holiday being celebrated, or sometimes when a lot of people marched around the neighborhood, he liked to hold the children. That's a Japanese, special day, or Buddha's birthday or something like that. There'd be a parade in Japantown. He was unassuming in a way. His teaching was unusual in that he didn't claim to know the right answers, but when he spoke on some philosophical subject, he would do it authoritatively. And I'd say, well, he didn't put himself above others. And she says, he was still very authoritarian in spite of that. He combined so many opposite things. He was strict and authoritarian, yet he seemed to be friendly and open to ideas. She says, I don't like organizations and politics and so on. I haven't gotten into any offices in center or on the board and so on. But he had this quality of attracting people to him that could carry on the organization and make it a very viable group. You say you don't like organizations, but my understanding is that you were the main supporter, the main financial supporter of Zen Center when the budget was lower. She said, in the beginning, when we just had a few people, and I said, did you do that with your teacher's salary or did you have outside income? She said, no, just my teacher's salary. Seems to me I gave them $100 a month. My salary wasn't a lot then. She said, I taught in a school in Oakland. I would leave shortly after 5 in the morning and make my sandwich and a thermos of coffee, and I'd go to Zen Center and be there from 6 to 7. Then I would drive to Oakland. Oh, yeah, she was in Sausalito. Then I would drive to Oakland and sit and eat my breakfast in the teacher's lounge and get ready for school. For about 5 years, I did that routine. I taught in West Oakland, Hoover Junior High at the time. And I said, what was the racial and socioeconomic breakdown? She said it was largely black. And I said, so you taught many poor black people, any middle class? She says, mostly poor black. I was in Oakland for 33 years and taught both junior high and senior high. Quite a bit of the time I was in West Oakland, and then I was at a high school in a more wide area. I retired in 1976. I started in 42 or 43 during the war. My first couple of years were in the country near Marysville in a little town called Sutter near Chico, an area that was rather flat except for the Southern Buttes, which are an aberration of geology. I said, where did you come from? And she says, Los Angeles originally. I went to UCLA for the first 3 years, then moved to Berkeley and got my teacher credentials. And I said, that was a time at which there was a large influx of blacks from the South to here to build ships. You must have witnessed an enormous change in black society and community from those days to now. She says, that area was quite different. When I started teaching, there were more whites, but gradually it became mostly black. I left before they started selling drugs in the hallways or shooting on the front steps. So I said, when you started, it was more peaceful? She said, I guess so. There was antagonism, though, between whites and blacks. And I'd say it was integrated in the 40s. She said, I think so. And I'd say, what about the effect of welfare? And she says, well, in a way it's necessary. I don't know what can be done. There's got to be welfare. What is needed is better health care and child care, daycare. Yeah, it's true today, too. All through the police department and so on, they'll arrest a black before they'll arrest a white. I don't see how the situation can be improved. And they keep passing laws like 3 strikes and you're out. And it's partly to keep them in their place. I said, a lot of greed, hate, and delusion-based laws. Is there anything we missed? And she says, I was thinking about the location of Zen Center on Page Street. They located in a poor neighborhood. Another example, if he was shopping in a market for fruits or vegetables, he would be likely to take a damaged one, feeling sorry for it or wanting to use it. Goes with humility. That's true, but that was before Page Street. That was back on Bush Street. And I said, did you see him get angry much outside of formal situations? She said, no. He would only get angry for our own good. I said, the first 2 years he was there, Oksan wasn't there. What did he do? Did he cook for supper for himself? And she says, after not so very long, there was a woman who took over, did a lot of the cooking and cleaning, a Caucasian woman. I'm foggy on that. Ask Della. I say, well, Della's a little shy to say anything. And Betty says, I always think she remembers that she's there and sees more. Della was sort of a chauffeur for Suzuki Roshi. She would take him to the airport and meet friends from the airport, take him shopping. I think she probably did things like get his clothes to the laundromat, little motherly things like that. Then this other woman who was much taken with him and was doing housekeeping things. Yeah, that other woman, that's the one who bought him long underwear, and he loved it. He always wore long underwear if it was all cool or anything after that. And she left when Mitsu Suzuki arrived, his wife. Betty says, oh, we had this outing. I forgot why we went there, up near the Russian River. Somebody had a cabin there. I remember it was a several-hour drive up there. We went walking around a bit. Suzuki found some fronds of bracken, the young tender leaves before they unfold. They're something like asparagus. We cut some bracken. He knew what to do. The bracken has to be boiled with ashes before it's used. And I say, oh, Covancino used to do this. She said, so he picked bracken. The little cabin had a wood stove with ashes in it. So he boiled the bracken with ashes, and that was part of our meal. It was very tasty, sort of like asparagus. I remember him as being very knowledgeable about things close to nature. At Tassajara, he knew to be with the earth and used it and work with it. That little man, who hardly weighed 100 pounds, knew how to move a huge boulder. I don't know with long crowbar or what. He knew how to use it and get it where he wanted. And I'd say, well, he was skilled with stones. He worked with them all his life. He was interested in gardens. He knew the balance point of rocks. He'd know when a rock should be drilled to make it split. People would work at it, and he'd go up, walk around, feel it, look at it, and say, right here. He really had skill. He also said some rocks were alive and some were dead. He was so happy at Tassajara to get back again into stones. I think Bush Street was a wonderful experience for him and a very intimate experience with people, but he must have missed the outdoors. In Japan, all the temples were on the edge of town and had beautiful streams and rocks. Well, that's not true. But they tend to all have gardens. But, I don't know every temple in Tokyo and Osaka and everything. He made wonderful gardens. How would you describe him physically, I asked. And she says, small, but with tremendous energy. Energy in a small package. I would guess he didn't weigh much, maybe 100 pounds. His weight was probably okay for his frame. His eyes were piercing. He would see right through you. As for his physical appearance, he was always wearing robes, so it was hard to tell how much was inside it. And I said, did you ever see him without his false teeth? She said, no. And I say, well, he wouldn't let people. And it says, tell a story of losing false teeth on way to Tassajara. Oh, yeah. Well, why didn't we transcribe that? Yeah, he got out to pee on this side of the road, and somehow his false teeth fell out. And he looked and looked and looked, and he couldn't find them. And I can't remember who was driving, Jane Schneider, who was Jane Runkden, or maybe. But he went to his cabin. He wouldn't come out until another set of false teeth. He had another set in the city were brought to him. And I'd say, do you see a continuous line from studying with Suzuki to what you're doing now? And what she was doing now was this Vision Quest thing. She says, yeah, might not be apparent to anyone else. I feel that this work is a culmination of everything I've ever done in my life. Meditation is a strong thread. Then my environmental interest is a strong thread. And teaching, I'm now trying to communicate what I feel about meditation, teaching it, and trying to help people appreciate the earth we live on, trying to help them establish a relationship with themselves and with the earth. We have a business, a nonprofit organization, Wilderness Transitions. What we do is lead vision quests. One of the wonderful things about Buddhism is that it can encompass everything else. Native Americans love the earth, awareness of how they're living. And I say, I've heard Buddhism criticized by a friend of mine who's an environmentalist and interested in Indian approaches. I'm talking about Peter Warshaw there. He says that we need to include the traditional native peoples' religions because the major religions aren't earth-oriented. And she says, my earth orientation and Buddhism are compatible. My meditation makes me appreciate the earth more. It may be my own combination. And I say, do you feel that Buddhism, as you learned it, included this earth orientation? She says, yes, because it points to the oneness of all things. This oneness includes earth and its creatures. Like the vows, I may expand sentient beings to not just humans. Well, sentient beings naturally includes not just humans, but every other life form as well, including the rocks, the landscapes of the earth. There, that's what Suzuki felt too. And I'd say we'd be hard put to find anything that was not included in all sentient beings. Although in traditional Buddhism, it was just animals. They didn't include plants. Incidentally, the picture of like the baby Buddha, you have these statues with he has his right hand pointing down. It pointing to the earth means, establishing oneself on the earth. One reason why you don't find environmentalism a lot in old writings and everything is because everybody lived in nature. They didn't have, there were big cities in the past, but people lived with nature and it was, they didn't have this separateness. This is the way I feel, that people feel today, this fictional separateness. And Betty says, I'm not at all a traditional Buddhist. Thich Nhat Hanh includes all other creatures, the concept of inner being, that you cannot be alone, including the landscapes. In our work, we try to include Christians or Jews or Native Americans or atheists or whatever, Gaia, the planet Earth. Perhaps our basic philosophy is that everyone agrees on a love for the earth and a love for all its creatures. This might not be Orthodox Buddhism, but it is my Buddhism combined with my environmental approaches. I said, well, the more you look at Orthodox Buddhism, the less you might want to be associated with it. But then there's two sides to that. She says, I have my own little ceremonies I do in the morning. I greet the sun, and I greet Suzuki Roshi, and I recite the Heart Sutra. That's about the extent of it. And I said, that's great. When you first started sitting with Suzuki, there was probably no chanting, no service. She says, oh, yeah. But we recited the Heart Sutra in Japanese. And I said, when you first went, was there something for you to read? She said, I guess it took a little while to get it printed. That's right. At first, they didn't chant. But then one day, he handed out chant cards. And I said, was it those wonderful gray cards? She said, yeah, cards. Had the characters in the English. She recites in Japanese, kanji, zaibo. And she goes till she can't remember. And I said, well, he couldn't remember either. I used to take him to people's homes to chant because he had to do memorial services in homes too. And he liked to have somebody there with him because he'd forget. She says, there was one morning I was the only one who came to meditation. Maybe I was doing the gong at the time for the sutra. Suzuki and I were reciting the sutra. One of us would have to pause, take a breath, so the other one would have to carry on. Oh, wow. And I said, so people helped him hit the bells and drums. She says, oh, yeah, I did the gong for a while. I carried the stick for a while. Did he call it jikido? My recollection is that, but my Japanese is very weak. These days, jikido is someone who takes care of the zendo, I say. We did a lot of work on that zendo, she says. There was a time we refinished the whole floor and took out all the pews, the sander. Philip and Paul Alexander ran the floor finisher, rented a sander and finished the floor. Oh, she says, I was really surprised not long ago. Dick Baker telephoned me from Colorado, just called me up to say hello and chat a bit. I said, do you remember any sibling rivalry between him and Bill Kwong? She said, I wasn't in on that, but I was aware it was there. She said, Dick did a lot of showy things. Goddess Tasahara. He knew the former owner, so maybe he attributes our getting Tasahara to Dick. Well, yeah. And Dick also, when she says he, Suzuki, and Dick also got us a lot of big donations. He had the gift of financial acumen. And I say, Mike Dixon says from the day Dick became president of Zen Center, everything was changed. He said he had a plan. He started putting his plan in. Mike doesn't say this with bitterness. That was Dick's character, expansive. She said, yeah, he was filling the role. I said, do you think Suzuki had any shortcomings, weaknesses, blind spots? She said, well, just like anyone else. She said Dick was very much trying to make this Zen an American Zen. Things like chanting in English were necessary to make Zen an American institution. Maybe Suzuki would give on points like that, thinking that Dick knew more about what would go over here. She said, Zen Center has survived and been able to go on without Suzuki. So I think that a lot of that was necessary to establish an American institution. And I say, you have a very accepting point of view. Anything else? Like Ananda's trip, his first point about Suzuki Roshi was that he was not enlightened. And she said, yeah, if you asked him, he would say he was not enlightened. Mitsu would say he was not enlightened. I think he was enlightened. It means knowing that you're not enlightened. This is it. That's all. Enlightenment is realizing the beauty, the significance, the sublimity of this earth. I said, do you think maybe people have too much of an idea of what enlightenment is? She says, yeah. Enlightenment is having rice crusts and hot water for breakfast and being aware of it. And I said, do you think that Suzuki increased, mellowed, worked on, developed his enlightenment in America? And she said, since he changed so much from Japan to the United States, I think no doubt it increased his comprehension about what this world is, how people can be in this world, having a mission and being able to fulfill it to a certain degree. I said, I think one of the ideas people have about enlightenment is obviously erroneous, that it's some place you get to. You stop learning, you've gotten it all. Obviously, he continued to learn. She said, there's no stopping, there's no place to reach. I realized that is a sort of enlightenment, to realize that there is no stopping place. It's not a place to get to, she says. Some people do get to a very much more rarefied place. Some people said that Trudy Dixon was enlightened as her cancer progressed. One thing she said to me once was this blessed cancer, implying that the cancer had brought her to a new stage of understanding or enlightenment. She wouldn't have called it enlightenment. It had brought her to a new understanding. Yeah, Suzuki said when Bob Halpern drove him to see Trudy when she was quite ill, he visited with her and he came out and he said to Bob, now there's a real Zen master. And She says, I think people facing their own mortality, making a new lease on life, a new appreciation of the value of this moment, how wonderful it is to be alive in this moment. And I say, I hope we can develop the ability to become enlightened with health. That seems to be what you're doing. And she said, on these trips, on these vision quests, we do feel we give people an opportunity to get a new lease on life. A lot of people come because they're troubled with problems of their life, of their lifestyle, their age, their illness, their partner, their relationships, their careers. On one of our early trips, there were a pair of gay men. They were totally accepted by the group. Just before they went out on their solo, they were asked, what's the problem you're going to be working on? One fellow said, I'm only 28, but I have to face my own mortality. He was HIV positive. After that, everybody hugged them both more warmly. He's now gone with AIDS. He and his partner both died of AIDS. There was a whole write-up in the last issue of the Journal of Earth Island Institute about him. He was a wonderfully happy and intensely alive person. Yeah, you had to learn to do it by yourself. I think a lot of people have gained some strength from the way Suzuki taught and the way he would go to the other side and pull the rug out from under them. Some people have seemed to depend too much on him or on some idea of him, seem to be sort of weak. Some people have some idea, some people I talk to, it's like they feel their life is over because they can't study with him, or that when he died, the Dharma died. And she said, he taught exactly the opposite of that. You have to find your own truth. Incidentally, I, DC, do not feel that. I don't think about that anymore. I don't feel critical of other people's understanding. Everybody's got their own way of understanding things, and if their understanding evolving. And basically, I agree with the ancient wisdom of Socrates, who said he didn't know anything, or Meister Eckhart, who said the key was to know nothing, have nothing, want nothing. So if somebody has some understanding that is not the way I see things, I tend not to be very critical of them anymore. Here's a post I made on the 30th of July in 2006. Betty Warren, one of Shunryu Suzuki's first American students, died today at 5:40 a.m. in her bed at the Redwoods, a retirement home in Mill Valley, California. Betty had been fading for some months and seemed to be a classic example of what's called dying of old age. Maybe she died of heart failure. She was 89. She would have been 90 on September 17th. Oh, I'm going to read you Betty's prayer. She said the first 3 lines of it were from Stephen Batchelor's Buddhism Without Beliefs. Since death alone is certain, and the time of death uncertain, what should I do? This is my prayer. I give thanks for this day, though it may be my last. I shall live it fully in the here and now, with joy in all the beauty, the pleasure, and the pain, with gratitude for this incredible gift of consciousness, with trust in the great spirit that dwells within each creature, animal, plant, and landscape, with love for all creation and compassion for myself and all my relations, my fellow travelers on this journey of wonders, with Gacho, Betty. And she dated that July 9th, 2000. And a few days after Betty died, I posted this on Kook.com. It says, I've got more on Betty Warren to put up, but won't have time till Friday. I want to put up an article she wrote in the late 90s about how she became an activist and other stuff. Also looking for her Buddhist name, which had something to do about sun rays shining through clouds in it. Actually, I've got her Roxu. I ended up with her Roxu. Betty met Shunryu Suzuki the first week he was in America. In 1970, Betty joined Marilyn Riley Hindi on a vision quest in the Southern California desert. She kept doing them. She and Marilyn formed a nonprofit educational organization called Wilderness Transitions. When she stopped doing these vision quests at the age of 83, she had done 60 of them. A number of people visited Betty at the Redwoods. I'd been keeping up with her for years. She told me recently that if anything, there were too many people visiting her. She said that hospice was coming by every day. I asked her why, and she said it was because she was dying. It really went quickly, not her mind, but her body and her sight and hearing. It wasn't that long ago, maybe half a year ago, that she told my son Clay and me that she was having the best meditation of her life, but she was also getting weaker. Her heart, she said, was getting weaker. She was sad. She had to stop going to the Friday afternoon demonstration against the invasion of Iraq that folks at the Redwoods have been doing ever since the war began. And I've got a bunch about that you can see in pictures of her with the big sign. And I joined them some out there right across from Tam High in Mill Valley and on the edge of the Redwoods property. Then a couple of months ago, she said she couldn't do anything anymore, couldn't read or even listen to music or even meditate. I said she had that in her bones, and she agreed. Her mind seemed fine, but she was getting blinder and deafer, and it was getting hard for her to recognize people. About a month ago, she was so disoriented, it took her almost all day to get dressed. And I was there. Well, I wasn't all. Well, I was visiting her, and she spent the whole time trying to get dressed. I mean, she had on like a slip or something, but she just couldn't do it. I contacted Marilyn Hindi, the closest person to her, who was out of town, and talked to folks at the desk of the Redwoods about it. The time I was there before, she'd taken the wrong walker, which I returned to the rightful owner and got hers back to her. What happened is, as a result of that, Betty was moved from the level of living there where you take care of yourself with some help to really an area for people who need help just to do everything. And in talking to staff there, what I learned was once people go to that section where you need a lot of help, they don't tend to live. They don't tend to live long. And then I write, the last I saw her was a few weeks ago on the way to Tassaro with Clay. We sat with her and her friend Kay Watanabe, who lived just down the hall from her and who ate dinner with her every night. Betty was still going to meals, but she was in a wheelchair. She'd been moved to a new room in the skilled nursing section. She barely recognized me. I had to get up real close and say my name loudly. It had only been a few months before that we were sitting in her room talking fairly normally, her saying that she didn't need to go anywhere, that she had everything in the whole universe right there. She loved her room where she lived for some years, ever since she'd moved from her home in Sausalito, where she lived so many decades. And she loved the view she had of the wetlands and trees. There was a single white crane standing by the water below. So that gives you a little picture of Betty Warren and, some rambling talk between her and me, and really an inspirational person. There was a woman who she had a long relationship with that that's mentioned in the biography of her that's on Q.com, and there's pictures of them too. Okay. Well, Betty, it was great knowing you. Oh, Bill Kwong did her funeral. I was there, and it was very touching. And of course, that's what she wanted. She was very, those older students, they really liked Bill Kwong, and they felt like Bill Kwong continuing the spirit of Shunryu. This has been a Cuke Audio Podcast. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Doggett Bandita, Feline Manis, Guest Doggett, Bambita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.